ballroom doors opened, and every conversation died before Serena Hart took her first step inside. At the head table, Conrad Mercer stopped smiling. Serena stood beneath the golden archway in a fitted black gown that followed her tall, curving figure before falling into a long, elegant train. Diamonds rested at her throat, her long black curls swept over one shoulder, and her warm brown skin glowed beneath the chandeliers. But it was not her beauty that silenced the room. It was the way she entered without hesitation. She did not look like the abandoned ex-wife Conrad had spent 3 years describing as broken, bitter, and unable to survive without his name. She looked like a woman who knew something he did not. As Serena crossed the marble floor, champagne glasses paused halfway to painted lips. Guests turned from private conversations. A photographer abandoned the couple posing near the stage and aimed his camera toward her. Conrad had invited Serena as a joke. He had chosen her seat himself, table 27, beside the service doors, far enough from the stage to make her feel invisible. But Serena never looked toward it. She kept walking directly toward the head table. Then an elderly man seated beside Foundation Chairman Thomas Hale rose the moment he recognized her. Thomas stood next. Conrad's fiancée whispered something, but he did not answer. His assistant was already hurrying toward him with a sealed black envelope that had not been included in the evening's program. Conrad opened it beneath the table. By the time he reached the final line, the color had drained from his face. His assistant looked toward Serena. Then toward security. Serena had come to discover why 3 women's shelters were about to close. She had expected Conrad to humiliate her. What she had not expected was for her entrance to make him afraid. And she still had no idea what was written inside the envelope. If you enjoy powerful stories where betrayal meets unforgettable justice, subscribe to Luxury Justice Stories. Now, let's continue. Before Serena reached the head table, Conrad's assistant stepped into her path with a polished smile and an open hand. He reminded her that table 27 had been reserved in her name. The gesture looked courteous from a distance, but the security officers had already shifted closer to the aisle. Conrad wanted the room to see Serena redirected. He wanted her humiliation to look orderly. Serena glanced once at the untouched place card near the service doors, then turned without protest. The ballroom watched her cross the floor a second time, but she did not lower her head. By accepting the seat, she denied Conrad the confrontation he had prepared. She also gained a clear view of the service corridor, the accounting staff, and every nervous employee moving between the ballroom and the foundation offices. The envelope had come from attorneys representing the foundation's largest anonymous donor. Its next multi-million-dollar payment had been placed on hold until the board reviewed the shelter program's finances. Serena's name appeared nowhere in the letter. Conrad had no proof she was involved, yet he ordered his assistant to prevent her from approaching board members or entering any private meeting. Removing her would create a scandal before the program even began, so he tried to contain her instead. Serena placed her black clutch beside the untouched wine glass and waited. She had spent 3 years avoiding rooms like this because public attention always turned her family, her marriage, and her money into one story. Tonight, silence was no longer protecting only her. It might be protecting whoever had placed 3 shelters in danger. Margaret Ellis reached the table before the orchestra finished its first piece. The shelter director's tired eyes sharpened when she saw Serena's place card beside the service entrance. Years earlier, Margaret and Serena had spent long nights finding temporary rooms, job interviews, and emergency child care for women escaping financial abuse. After the divorce, Serena continued helping through quiet visits and funding decisions that carried no public credit. Conrad became the visible face of the work. Serena had told herself visibility did not matter as long as beds remained open. Margaret leaned close and said, "I was beginning to think you would never come back." There was no anger in the words, only the exhaustion of someone who had been protecting a program while more powerful people argued over its image. Margaret placed the Gala program in front of Serena. 3 neighborhood shelters had received notices warning that their funding could end within 60 days. Conrad planned to announce a grand flagship center bearing the Mercer name while describing the smaller locations as inefficient. The glossy rendering showed marble floors, private offices, and a wall designed for donor photographs. It did not show where families would sleep while existing beds disappeared. The closure letters blamed delayed major donations. Serena read that line twice. She knew the explanation was false, though the reason was one of the truths she had kept hidden. Before she could ask Margaret another question, Daniel Price, a nervous accounting employee, paused beside the table and slipped a folded invoice beneath the program. The invoice covered flowers, custom gifts, and gala films. Those costs had first been charged to the event, then moved into an account reserved for emergency housing. A handwritten approval mark appeared beside the change. Daniel whispered that donor council had requested records that afternoon and several files disappeared from the shared system soon afterward. The invoice did not prove the whole scheme, but it showed a deliberate choice. Conrad saw Daniel leave and crossed the ballroom. His smile vanished when he reached Serena. He warned that a public accusation could frighten donors and shelter partners before anyone understood what had happened. If the foundation collapses, Conrad said, the women you claim to protect will suffer first. Serena asked whether the closure notices were real. Conrad avoided the question. Instead, he reached for the version of their divorce he had repeated for 3 years. If she challenged him, he would tell the room that her settlement was no longer enough and that she had returned for money. The threat found the old wound. Conrad knew Serena feared being reduced to wealth, scandal, or a famous surname. He had built his reputation around her refusal to defend herself. Serena looked toward the service doors. 2 shelter residents were distributing programs beneath a logo built from stories like theirs. Leaving would protect Serena's pride, but it would leave everyone else inside Conrad's version of the truth. She stayed. Conrad returned to the stage before anyone else could shape the room. He praised sacrifice, loyalty, and the people who built lasting institutions. Then he added that history often confused those who created a legacy with those who merely stood near it. He never said Serena's name. He did not need to. Several guests turned toward table 27. Conrad's fiancée smiled, still hearing the story as he had taught it. Serena held her expression steady, though the insult landed exactly where he intended. Then a woman from a nearby table rose and crossed the floor. Years earlier, she had entered one of the shelters with 2 children, 1 suitcase, and no access to her husband's bank account. The woman bent beside Serena. You stayed until the landlord changed the lock and put the new key in my hand. My children slept behind a door he could not open because of you. She returned to her seat before Serena could answer. Across the ballroom, the elderly man who had stood at Serena's entrance watched without moving toward her. One glance in his direction could have brought resources Conrad could not match. Serena refused to give it. Whatever happened next had to remain her decision. The small question had been answered. People in the room knew Serena's connection to the shelters. The larger question grew sharper. If Conrad knew her history, why was he so determined to erase it now? The facts began forming a sequence. Margaret's notices blamed delayed donations. Daniel's invoice showed gala expenses moved into emergency housing after objections. An older report identified the foundation's largest source of support, while the current version praised Conrad's fundraising. Finance officer Elaine Foster admitted directors had questioned the transfer weeks earlier. Conrad promised the money would be restored, then postponed the review. Mercer Hotels had expanded too quickly, tightening its cash while lenders reviewed refinancing. Conrad had promised the company would fund part of the gala and the new center. Instead, restricted shelter money had preserved the appearance of strength. Conrad had convinced himself the transfer was temporary. Once a major partnership closed, he planned to replace every dollar. But a delayed deal inconvenienced Conrad. A delayed grant meant locked doors and families turned away. Serena still lacked the full record. Fragmentary accusations would let him portray her as a bitter ex-wife seeking revenge. During a break, Conrad found her in the corridor with a statement prepared by his lawyers. It described Serena as an early volunteer and donor advisor but denied that she had founded Second Door. In exchange for her signature, silence, and immediate departure, Conrad would guarantee one threatened shelter for the year. Serena asked what would happen to the other two. Conrad replied that leadership required choices. The offer revealed more than he intended. He would save one shelter only if Serena helped preserve the history he had written for himself. Then the argument became personal. Conrad said her secrecy had damaged their marriage. She had refused to explain her family, her financial security, or the fear that made her retreat whenever money entered a room. He believed she had always looked down on him. Serena could not dismiss that pain entirely. She had hidden herself because she wanted love without the weight of wealth. Her silence had created distance. It had not authorized fraud, erasure, or the use of vulnerable families as collateral. Serena returned the unsigned statement and re-entered the ballroom. Conrad's confidence slipped. He had expected anger, fear, or a demand he could portray as greed. She gave him none of them. Daniel's courage nearly failed before the next course was served. Conrad's assistant approached him with a reminder that his position was under review and that disclosing internal records could end his career. Daniel moved toward the exit with the invoice copy trembling in his hand. Serena did not stop him or promise protection she could not guarantee. She told him only that records could be submitted through counsel without forcing him to speak publicly before he was ready. Daniel looked toward the shelter residence near the service doors, then handed the original email chain to Thomas Hale's legal advisor. The emails showed that Conrad's office requested the transfer after finance staff objected and ordered the money restored only after the hotel partnership closed. The evidence remained incomplete, but the attempt to silence Daniel gave the board reason to preserve every file. Conrad then appeared to regain control. The proposed Mercer Center filled the screen, and he announced that he had personally guaranteed the foundation's future. The room applauded. Thomas remained seated but did not interrupt before counsel verified the records. Conrad saw the board's caution and mistook it for loyalty. His fiancée received remarks prepared for her and found a paragraph thanking Conrad for personally providing money that had actually come through the anonymous donor. She confronted him in a private alcove. Conrad admitted funds had been moved but insisted the partnership would repair everything. Exposing him before the agreement closed, he said, could cost thousands of jobs. When she asked why he hid the transfer, he answered that leaders sometimes protected people from facts they could not handle. His answer made the pattern clear. Conrad did not merely hide bad news. He decided which truths others were allowed to know, then called control protection. His fiancée crossed out the false paragraph, refused to deliver the speech, and carried the marked page to Thomas. Through counsel, Thomas now had Daniel's invoice, the email chain, the closure notices, and earlier board minutes. What he still lacked was Serena's consent to correct the public record. For years, Serena had believed remaining unseen kept the work pure. Now that secrecy was being used to close shelters and isolate employees who tried to speak. Thomas found her beside table 27 and asked whether she was prepared to be named. Serena looked toward Margaret, Daniel, and the two residents standing near the service doors. She also looked toward the elderly man who had risen at her entrance. He had not approached her or tried to take control. For once, he was waiting. Serena understood that silence had stopped being humility. It had become permission. She gave Thomas consent. The board gathered briefly in a private conference room. Counsel confirmed that enough evidence existed to suspend Conrad's control of charitable funds, preserve the financial records, and stop the planned announcement while a full investigation began. Conrad saw the revised page as the host returned to the microphone and ordered it removed. Thomas overruled him. The ballroom quieted. This silence was different from the one that followed Serena's entrance. It carried the tension of an evening changing direction. The host asked every guest to look toward table 27, the seat beside the service doors Conrad had chosen for the woman he wanted overlooked. A spotlight found Serena. The Mercer Center rendering disappeared from the screen. The host announced her full name, Serena Hart, original founder of the Second Door Initiative, managing trustee of the Hart Family Trust, and only daughter of the reclusive industrialist seated beside Thomas Hale. In place of Conrad's rendering appeared records from second door's earliest years, the first shelter lease, photographs of Serena working beside Margaret, and grant authorization signed before Conrad became the foundation's public face. Serena's late mother had created the Hart Family Trust. Serena had approved its largest annual grants and continued them after the divorce because she refused to make vulnerable families pay for her failed marriage. Conrad had mistaken privacy for dependence. The woman he seated beside the service doors had kept the program alive while allowing him to receive the applause. Serena's father rose, but he did not approach her. In the past, he had used money to settle arguments and influence decisions. That was why Serena had spent much of her adult life avoiding his world. This time he understood that public support could still take the decision from her. Margaret stood. The former resident stood beside her. Daniel remained near the back wall, frightened but no longer alone. Others followed because the records restored a history they had witnessed. Conrad stared at the woman whose silence he had mistaken for weakness, then moved toward the microphone before the room could settle. He accused Serena of concealing her identity throughout their marriage, allowing him to believe the trust had no connection to her, and withdrawing while he carried the foundation's public burden. He said she had used a hidden fortune to stage his humiliation. The accusation changed the room because part of it was true. Several guests sat down. Serena accepted the microphone and admitted she had hidden her family because she feared being valued for money. After the divorce, she allowed her name to disappear because quiet support felt cleaner than public conflict. That choice made it easier for Conrad to rewrite the foundation's history and harder for honest employees to challenge him. Serena did not claim blamelessness. She asked the room to consider what happened after her silence became useful to someone else. Thomas presented the evidence piece by piece. Board minutes showed Conrad delaying review. Elaine confirmed he authorized the transfer after objections. Daniel identified the invoices and emails. Margaret read the shelter closure dates. Conrad's fiancée produced the speech falsely crediting him with donor funding. Counsel displayed his electronic approval ordering restoration only after the hotel partnership closed. No single document solved everything. Together, they revealed a man who believed good intentions entitled him to use restricted money, deceive the board, and decide which families could absorb the risk. Conrad warned that withdrawing the trust support and cancelling the hotel partnership could cripple Mercer Hotels, cost employees their jobs, and leave the shelters with less. Serena's father wanted both relationships ended immediately. His companies were connected to the partnership Conrad needed, and one decision from him could damage Mercer Hotels within weeks. Serena now held the control she had always resisted. Remaining silent would protect Conrad but leave the shelters exposed. Destroying him that night would make innocent workers carry the price of his fear. Neither choice felt like justice. Serena remembered the residents, hotel employees, and shelter staff already paying for decisions they had not made. She had not come to prove she could ruin Conrad. She had come to stop him from deciding whose losses mattered. Serena asked the board to freeze Conrad's authority, fund the threatened shelters directly for 6 months, and commission an independent audit. The foundation would be separated from Mercer Hotels. The business partnership would remain paused until Conrad cooperated, restitution was secured, and outside oversight existed. Her father wanted harsher consequences, but he respected her decision. The emergency vote removed Conrad as foundation chairman and barred him from directing donations. The Mercer Center announcement was cancelled. An experienced non-profit executive became interim director, and shelter representatives received seats on a new advisory council. Staff replaced the Mercer Center presentation with notice that the neighborhood shelters would remain open. The trust sent 6 months of funding through independent supervision. Investors paused the hotel partnership and required Conrad to preserve records, cooperate with the audit, and accept oversight. Reporters waited outside for Serena to demand his destruction. She released only a brief statement confirming that the shelters were secure and an investigation had begun. She would not use vulnerable women as scenery for a victory speech. Conrad returned to the head table and found that longtime admirers would no longer meet his eyes. His first real loss was not money but the authority he assumed would remain whenever he entered a room. The audit later confirmed the restricted transfer, image-building charges, and misleading claims. Regulators ordered restitution, imposed a civil penalty, and prohibited Conrad from managing charitable funds for several years. He repaid the money through reduced compensation and the sale of a vacation property. Hotel expansions were delayed, and an independent committee gained authority over major financial decisions. The partnership eventually resumed under stricter terms, preserving employee jobs while ending the unchecked control Conrad had abused. The foundation publicly restored credit to Serena, the original staff, and the women whose experiences shaped Second Door. Conrad accepted responsibility for the transfer and false claims, admitting that fear and hunger for recognition had led him to treat charitable resources as his own. He did not ask Serena to return. His fiancée postponed their marriage and left the foundation, unwilling to decide their future while he was still learning the difference between remorse and damage control. Serena served as temporary chair only long enough to rebuild the system, give shelter representatives permanent advisory seats, and appoint an independent leader. Months later, one threatened shelter reopened after renovation. Its community room carried the name of Serena's late mother. Serena arrived beside former residents, staff, and her father. One public victory had not repaired their relationship. He was learning not to turn influence into control, while Serena was learning that refusing power was not principled when silence allowed someone else to misuse it. Near the doorway, her father asked where she wanted the plaque. Before, he would have chosen the wall and called it a gift. This time he waited. Serena chose a place near the entrance. Conrad later sent a handwritten apology that accepted responsibility without asking Serena to forgive him. He acknowledged turning her privacy into weakness, erasing her work for recognition, and gambling with people least able to absorb a loss. Serena read the letter and placed it in a drawer. She was not ready to answer, and healing no longer required immediate reconciliation. For once, she did not measure her strength by how quietly she endured pain. Before leaving the reopened shelter, the new director showed her the corrected website history and asked how she wanted to be listed. For years, Serena had hidden her name from her father's fortune and watched Conrad remove it from her work. This time she answered without apology, Serena Hart, founder. She had entered Conrad's ballroom under the name he believed meant nothing and left carrying it openly, without hiding behind her father's wealth or former husband's reputation. Her victory was not that the room finally understood her power. It was that she no longer needed silence to prove she was different from those who misused power. Conrad lost control because he treated trust as something he could borrow and replace later. Serena regained hers by understanding that dignity sometimes meant standing in the place chosen to make you invisible and telling the truth before someone else paid for your silence. Do you believe Serena made the right decision, or would you have handled it differently? Tell us in the comments. Subscribe to Luxury Justice Stories for more powerful stories of betrayal, courage, and unforgettable justice. Watch next, a billionaire fakes paralysis to test his wife, but the cruelest betrayal comes from the family he trusted most.